The land had always been a quiet inheritance, tucked into the corner of the county and wrapped in silence that only old trees could provide. My grandfather had left it to me years ago, a wide stretch of ground that most people in town seemed to forget even existed. For a long time, I had no reason to think much about it either. Life kept me busy, and the property sat untouched, unbothered, and nearly invisible to those who didn't know its history. But my grandfather had been meticulous. He never let go of a single document, and in a battered lockbox in my attic rested the original deed with his name, and now mine, written across it in careful ink. It wasn't just some forgotten corner of dirt. The land had value, even if people failed to see it at first glance. The soil was good, the location near expanding neighborhoods, and its size alone made it a prize for any developer bold enough to take a chance. Yet no one ever came to me about it. No letters, no offers, no questions. For years, it was as though I owned a ghost lot, invisible to the eyes of the town. That quiet ended when I noticed changes creeping in at the edges. Survey markers I hadn't placed appeared, little orange flags fluttering in the wind. Heavy trucks rolled down roads that weren't supposed to be there. At first, I thought it was just city work nearby, maybe something with the utilities. But the deeper I looked, the clearer it became that someone had plans, and they thought my land was theirs to use. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind. Asterisk, never lose that deed. It's your shield, even when you don't realize you need it. Asterisk. The first time I truly paid attention was on a Saturday morning when the low rumble of machinery carried through the trees. At first, I assumed it was roadwork from the county, maybe some maintenance near the highway. But when I walked farther toward the noise, I found something that stopped me cold. Bulldozers, excavators, and trucks filled with gravel were crawling across my land like ants. Surveyors in bright vests hammered stakes into the ground, marking neat rows where foundations would soon sit. I stood there for several minutes, half hidden by the tree line, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The workers moved with purpose, as though they belonged there. No one looked around nervously, no one asked permission. They behaved as though they owned the ground they were digging into. It was only when one of the crew leaders shouted, "This whole section's cleared by the HOA board," that I realized exactly what was happening. The homeowners association from the neighboring subdivision had expanded without hesitation, claiming my land as though it had been theirs all along. I walked up to one of the surveyors, introduced myself, and asked politely who had authorized this construction. He looked at me blankly, then laughed. "The HOA. Who else? This is their development site." He waved me off, not realizing I was the actual owner. My irritation burned quietly, but I didn't show it. Instead, I nodded, turned back, and left without argument. That night, I combed through the HOA's website and their glossy brochures. They were calling the project Oak Haven Estates Expansion. 96 new homes, playgrounds, and a clubhouse, all sitting squarely on land that had never belonged to them. They had no idea whose ground they were trespassing on. And I wasn't about to tell them. Not yet. I knew the only way to be certain was to dig into the records myself. Early the next morning, I drove down to the county courthouse, a place that still smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. The clerk behind the counter was friendly enough, sliding the heavy record books across to me when I explained I wanted to trace ownership of a particular parcel. Hours slipped by as I flipped through deeds, transfers, tax documents, and property maps. Every page I turned only confirmed what I already suspected. The land had never been sold, never transferred, never touched by the HOA or their developers. My grandfather's name appeared again and again, right up until the year he passed it down to me. The record was clean, unbroken, and indisputable. I sat back in the hard wooden chair, staring at the yellowed paper that carried both his signature and the official county stamp. My name was there too, entered into the books after his death. Legally, there was no question, it was mine. I asked the clerk if there had been any recent claims on the land, maybe something filed without my knowledge. She shook her head, telling me no liens, no purchases, no foreclosures, nothing. It was as though the HOA had simply decided the land was free for the taking. That arrogance made my teeth clench, but I forced myself to stay calm. On my way out, I made copies of every relevant document and tucked them carefully into a folder. Holding those papers felt like holding a weapon, one that could slice through every smug assumption the HOA had made. I could have walked straight to their office, slammed the deed down, and demanded they stop. But as I stepped outside into the sunlight, another idea began to form. One that required patience, silence, and perfect timing. The weeks that followed felt almost surreal. I would drive past the edge of my property and see the transformation happening piece by piece, as though I were watching a time-lapse of a neighborhood being born. First came the cleared lots, then the roads carved into the soil, neatly paved and lined with curbs. Sidewalks followed, smooth and white, stretching like ribbons across the land I knew was still mine. I never said a word, never interfered. I simply observed, quietly cataloging every detail. Soon, frames of houses began to rise, their skeletons of wood climbing higher each day. Crews worked tirelessly, hammering, sawing, shouting orders as the sun moved overhead. Within months, roofs appeared, walls were painted and driveways poured. It was like watching someone else furnish a house they thought they owned. All while the true owner stood silently at the window. The HOA was proud of themselves. They paraded prospective buyers through the half-finished streets, pointing out features and promising luxury living. Families came, some wide-eyed and excited, signing contracts and dreaming of their futures in Oak Haven estates. They had no idea they were stepping onto land that didn't belong to the association, or even the developers. What struck me most was how little anyone questioned it. Not a single person asked about the land's history. Not one buyer wondered about the paperwork. The HOA spoke with such confidence, with brochures and banners waving, that everyone assumed it was legitimate. I kept every flyer I found, every advertisement they published, adding them to my growing file of evidence. I could have stopped them at any point, but I didn't. Letting them finish felt more powerful. The higher they built their houses, the harder their fall would be when the truth finally came crashing down. It wasn't long before the HOA noticed me lingering too often near the edges of their shiny new neighborhood. One afternoon, as I was standing by the property line, a man in a pressed polo shirt and mirrored sunglasses marched over. His walk carried the kind of authority only someone full of themselves could muster. He introduced himself as the HOA president, his tone sharp and clipped, like he was already annoyed by my presence. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, crossing his arms. I told him simply that I was checking on the land. His eyes narrowed, and then he laughed, a short, mocking sound that grated against me. "This isn't your land. The HOA has full control of this development. You're trespassing." The word stung, not because it was true, but because of how carelessly he threw it out. I wanted to correct him right there, to pull the deed from my folder, and wipe the smugness off his face. But instead, I smiled politely and said nothing. His confidence grew with my silence. He warned me that if I kept wandering around, I could be fined. He even threatened legal action, waving his hand dismissively as if I were some petty nuisance he'd swat away. Behind him, a few board members nodded in agreement, their arrogance practically dripping off them. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Every insult, every threat, only fueled the quiet fire inside me. I let them talk, let them puff out their chests like roosters in a yard they didn't own. When they finally walked away, I stood still for a moment, gripping the folder under my arm. The deed was safe, and my patience was stronger than their arrogance. They thought they'd won that day. In truth, I was letting them dig their own grave. By the time summer rolled around, the neighborhood looked complete. Streets were lined with rows of identical houses, each with neat lawns and driveways freshly poured. Families had already moved in, kids riding bikes up and down the sidewalks, parents chatting by mailboxes, and the sound of dogs barking in fenced yards carrying through the air. The once empty land was now alive with activity, but every bit of it still rested on the ground tied to my name. I walked past sometimes, blending in with the joggers and walkers, unnoticed among the bustle. Each time I did, I studied the details. Addresses posted on mailboxes, HOA newsletters taped to doors, even the trash collection schedule. The HOA boasted in local papers about their newly expanded community. They hosted ribbon-cutting events, invited city officials, and bragged about their growing influence. I clipped every article, recorded every speech, and printed screenshots of every announcement. My file was thick now, bulging with proof of their arrogance. They had no clue that each piece of paper they proudly distributed was another nail in their coffin. Meanwhile, homeowners were told their HOA fees funded playgrounds, security patrols, and landscaping crews. I took photos of the receipts left tacked to bulletin boards, and even gathered brochures advertising future amenities. The irony of it all never left me. People were paying to live on land they technically had no right to. What struck me most was how comfortable the HOA had become in their illusion of power. They fined residents for having the wrong color fence, demanded approval for garden choices, and strutted around as if they owned everything. They thought their rules were unshakable. But while they built their kingdom of control, I was building something far stronger. My evidence was ready, my patience intact, and I knew the day of reckoning was coming soon. The turning point came when a letter showed up in my mailbox, stamped with the HOA's emblem, and written in their usual condescending tone. They informed me that since I was living adjacent to Oak Haven Estates, I was required to join their community association, pay monthly dues, and abide by their rules. The list of demands included restrictions on exterior paint colors, yard decorations, and even how many cars could be parked on my property. Reading it, I nearly laughed. They truly believed they had the authority to dictate what I could and couldn't do on my own land. That was the moment I knew it was time to act. I gathered my folder, now thick with documents, and walked into my lawyer's office. His eyebrows shot up as I spread the deed, the county records, and the mountain of evidence across his desk. He skimmed the HOA's glossy brochures, then chuckled dryly. They've built an entire subdivision on land they don't own. This isn't just arrogance, it's negligence. Together, we drafted a lawsuit. The complaint was direct and devastating. The HOA and its board members had unlawfully occupied and developed private property. Court dates were scheduled, and summonses delivered. Word spread quickly, and by the time the case hit the docket, the HOA board looked almost smug as they filed into the courtroom. They thought this would be easy, another nuisance they could brush aside with threats and money. I sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, hands resting on the worn folder. When the judge called for proof of ownership, their lawyers began with maps and development plans. Then my attorney stood, placed the old deed gently before the judge, and let silence fill the room. 96 homes sat on land the HOA never owned, and the weight of that truth was about to crash down. The air in the courtroom grew heavy the moment my lawyer slid the deed across the bench. The judge adjusted his glasses, carefully reading through the weathered paper while the room hushed. You could hear the rustle of coats, the nervous clearing of throats, and the shuffle of feet as people leaned forward to catch every word. The judge looked from the document to the county records, then back again, taking his time. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. This deed is valid. And according to our records, the land in question was never transferred. It remains the legal property of the plaintiff. A wave of whispers rippled through the courtroom like a sudden storm. Homeowners turned to one another, eyes wide, mouths open. Some gasped audibly. Others buried their faces in their hands as the realization sank in. They had mortgages, contracts, and debts tied to homes built on land they didn't actually own. The HOA president's confident smirk cracked into something closer to panic, though he tried hard to mask it. His lawyer stammered, flipping through binders of documents that suddenly meant nothing. One homeowner stood up in the gallery, unable to contain themselves. What does that mean for us? Are we trespassing? The judge silenced the room with a stern look, but the question hung heavy in the air. The HOA board members exchanged frantic glances, each one silently blaming the others for the oversight. They had built their empire on arrogance and assumption, and now the foundation was crumbling beneath them. I sat quietly, hands folded, watching the chaos unfold. I didn't need to gloat or raise my voice. The deed spoke louder than anything I could have said. For the first time since construction began, the balance of power had shifted.